Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi, Knowlton's Rangers. Welcome back to our series, Rendezvous with Death, where we're looking at the lives of Americans who joined the World War I effort years before America entered the war. In the previous episode, we saw the outbreak of World War I and how Americans were mobilizing for war within Paris. Now we're going to see what happens when they actually join the Foreign Legion and what it looks like to fight. And when we left our cast of characters, they were on a train to Rouen. The train to Rouen was crammed with volunteers from all over the world, and they were bound by a common commitment to serve France in what was becoming increasingly clear was her desperate hour. The Legion intended to use Rouen, a historic town in Normandy, for training new recruits, and few could have been more raw than this lot. Many were put up in a former girls' school that had been converted into a barracks. Compressed bales of straw covered the floor and served as beds. The town itself, only 70 miles from the nearest position of the advancing Germans, was in a state of flux, and this was clear to the Americans. David King later recounted, the city was teeming with a marvelous heterogeneous collection. Wounded from the British Army, stragglers from the Belgian Army, refugees, French reservists, British Army Service Corps units, all wandering around the streets aimlessly, some terribly depressed, others hilarious and singing, and a good portion of them drunk. William Thaw was bemused by the incredible racial, ethnic, national, linguistic, and occupational diversity of his new companions, approximately 1,200 of them in all. But he gleaned something else from this motley crew described by King that had washed up in Rouen ahead of the German tide. Thaw wrote at the time, "I'm going to take part, however small, in the greatest and probably last war in history, which has apparently developed into a fight of civilization against barbarism." That last reason may sound a bit grand and dramatic, but you would quite agree if you could hear the tales of French, Belgian, and English soldiers who have come back here from the front. The stories Thaw and his comrades heard about the conduct of the German army on its march through Belgium and into France could move even the most jaded. Certainly rumor and exaggeration played some part in magnifying the nature and scope of the atrocities, but the sheer volume of reports couldn't be denied. Perhaps the best-known act of barbarism, both then and now, was the sack of the Belgian town of Louvain. The city was burned, and hundreds of civilians were lined up and shot in revenge for the actions of francs-tireurs along the route that had taken the German army through the town on its way to Brussels. Francs-tireurs was the name given to Belgian guerrilla fighters that used the civilian population as a shield from behind in which to strike at the invaders, and this phrase generally means maverick. There's a debate over the scale and intensity of franc-tireur activity in August 1914, but the German High Command had made up its mind how to deal with this anticipated threat in advance. Collective responsibility for German deaths. This meant murdering innocent civilians to cow the population into cooperation. Louvain's famous library and university, founded in 1426, were left in ashes as well. But what occurred a few days before the burning of Louvain in the nearby town of Dinant was even worse. As historian Barbara Tuchman relates in her book, The Guns of August, they, the town's residents, were kept in the main square until evening, then lined up, women on one side, men opposite in two rows, one kneeling in front of the other. Two firing squads marched to the center of the square, faced either way, and fired till no more of the targets stood upright. 612 bodies were identified and buried, including Felix Fivet, aged 3 weeks. So even today, all throughout Belgium, you can find tombstones from 1914 that say, "Shot by the Germans." Clearly, Rouen in its current state was no place to train recruits. It was too close to the fighting. The military recognized the inadvisability of continuing with the original plan for the foreigners and re-embarked them for a long journey to the south, far away from the front, to the barracks at Toulouse. This is where the Americans and their multinational comrades in arms would be initiated into the legionnaire life. The French Foreign Legion, a unique institution composed of foreign volunteers serving under French officers, had initially been formed in 1831 to help subdue Algeria for France. The fact that the soldiers had no ties to France made it easier for politicians to send them abroad to do the dirty work of the empire. This famed unit already enjoyed a certain roguish mystique by the time the war in Europe broke out. By way of example, in one instance in 1863, 65 legionnaires held off 2,000 Mexican soldiers for over 10 hours at the Battle of Camarón. The last 5 surviving defenders mounted a bayonet charge when their ammunition ran out. This gritty reputation, however, shouldn't be confused with the glamorous luster of later depictions of the Legion, such as the 1939 film You Jest, for example. In 1914, legionnaires were seen as a hard lot, men running from something. They'd be seen as perverts, deserters, thugs, or worse. The discipline was severe, and the conditions were harsh. No one with better options signed up for the Legion for the most part. Serving primarily in the far-flung reaches of the French colonial empire, the Foreign Legion took in any foreigner, no question asked, or at least that was a popular understanding. It was largely true. The Spanish-American war veteran Jack Bowe sketched an outline of a professional legionnaire. He's taken at face value. He doesn't impair his citizenship. He retains his own individuality. No one pries into his foreign affairs. His troubles are his. He carries them, also his fame, without advertising. Whatever his status in civilian life, in the Legion, he is simply a legionnaire. It is not the place for weaklings. Invariably, they are used up in the training. Here are only the strong, who neither give nor ask favors.